You're listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.
Hi, it's Louisa Tanner Munson, and this is part 4 of the Saturn Through the Houses series, where I look at the effects of Saturn in the birth chart in the 4th house. I.e. so if at the time, place and date of your birth Saturn was in the 4th house, or at the end of this MP3 I'll be looking at the effects of Saturn when Saturn transits through the 4th house. So this is quite a big subject, because the 4th house is a real turning point in our birth charts. So if we think about the 4th house, the 4th house represents the part of our home, the part of our childhood, the part of our internal behaviours that were governed and created in childhood. The 4th house also represents one of our parents, usually the most nourishing and nurturing parent. So it's often seen as the house of the mother, but it might be the dad, according to whichever one really represents that parent. And the 4th house also represents our home and where we live. And I guess like our refuge, where we feel safe, where our family feels safe, and the kinds of goings on that exist in that place. Now, when you consider Saturn and what Saturn might bring to the 4th house, Saturn's about structure and rules and regulations. It's about paternalism. Saturn is actually one of the parental archetypes in the birth chart. And Saturn also represents a cooling down of energy. So it represents that feeling of restriction and tightening and slightly calmer, cooler feelings about things. It's not a passionate planet necessarily. Quite to the contrary, Saturn is sometimes seen as a bit of a damp squid, because the energy of Saturn very much dampens the humour. It can be pessimistic, it can be serious and contemplatory. So having it in a 4th house is quite a prominent and strong, resonant position for Saturn to be in. Often when we've got Saturn in the 4th house, it shows somebody who uses their home as a place to build structure. They're quite serious at home. The person with a 4th house Saturn might also be a bit of an introvert, because their house is a place of calm and possibly discipline and rules. And it's not a passionate place. The home is not a place where you get excited and passionate. The home is a place that is orderly and makes sense and runs quite effectively. It would be a home. I would imagine that someone with a 4th house Saturn in their childhood would have had possibly quite a strong parental influence at home. So somebody that you really needed to follow the advice of, somebody who would discipline if necessary, and where reward was given to good behaviour. So it's not a place of unconditional love. Having a 4th house Saturn doesn't really feel like unconditional love territory. It feels very much like a child is raised and cultured and created into a particular mould, one that serves the overall purpose of the home and the particular parent that is the strong parent in the family. So it's not a place of free expression. I would advise, if you've got a 4th house Saturn, I would really advise you listen to the podcast that I released a few days ago, I think around the 6th of June, in my Patreon page. And it's the recording to do with transactional analysis and astrology, and also the one about seeing our parents in astrology in our birth charts, because that will really, really relate to you, having a fourth house which represents one of the parents and our childhood, and having Saturn which also represents a parent. So one of your parents is very, very important to you. And it might not be that it's a good relationship. It might be that they're important to you because they have really created the life that you've got, whether you get on with them or not. It's a kind of suck it and see territory. It's a bit like Marmite. You either love them or hate them. But whatever your feelings towards that particular parent are, suffice to say, they have a very, very strong effect on your life. So fourth house Saturn is possible. I mean, Saturn isn't necessarily a popular planet in any house. You know, when people first start learning about astrology, they're much more interested to know where Jupiter is or Venus is, you know, because they seem to come with really, really positive messages. And the beneficial message of Saturn is often underappreciated and unobserved. I mean, Saturn brings us really fabulous lessons, but in the fourth house it seems particularly harsh because it represents a childhood that may not have been very much fun, a childhood where you would have to grow up quite quickly, a childhood where you'd need to assume responsibility, you know, beyond your years. It might be a childhood where you have some kind of responsibility to care for another sibling or to care for a parent. It's not a free space. And it can also show some kind of disaster or upset, some kind of childhood hurt to do with a parent that is very difficult to move on from, because being in the fourth house, which represents where our instincts and our behaviours are formed, to have some kind of emotional disappointment, which Saturn can often represent, having an emotional disappointment in the place of our childhood and in a place of our early behaviours is really a strong position. It really does guide us forwards. So, for instance, if you've had a huge disappointment, for instance, if your parents divorced early on, or if you lost a parent and that really affected you, it's not a given that it will affect you, because some people, have very, very different expectations in life. But and a lot depends on how it's handled at the time. But if you have had that kind of disaster with a parent, or had a parent that was absent for any number of reasons that has caused you pain, then having Saturn in the fourth house is huge, because as Saturn transits through all the different houses and makes angles to your natal Saturn, then it's going to create lots of trigger points. For instance, the first, the fourth, the seventh and the 10th house angles are all really important and will create new types of tension to do with responsibility and to do with a parent. So in particular around the age of 14 or 15, when your Saturn goes into the other house of the parent, the 10th house, as a natal fourth house Saturn person, that can create all sorts of tensions where there's a lot of friction with one of your parents, possibly the other parent, and where the original hurts and upsets get re-triggered. And again, when you have your Saturn return, that'll be a huge one because it's going through the place of your home. So it's worth understanding your hurts and pains if you have Saturn here, because Saturn moves relatively fast. Like Uranus, Neptune, Chiron, Pluto, they move at a much slower pace. I mean, their transits are much deeper acting, but you're less likely to have them. Whereas the Saturn transits, Saturn moves sign and house every 2.5 years. And so every 7 years, Saturn will be at 90 degrees or 180 degrees or 270 degrees. It will be at a right angle or 180 degrees away from your natal Saturn. And that will create a lot of tension for you. So you, more than anybody else in your house positions of Saturn, I would advise that you really come to understand the limitations that you have experienced from your childhood, come to understand them and come to accept them, so that when you get re-triggered, you can find something beneficial for them. As you grow up with a fourth house Saturn and come to terms with what it means to have had quite a sobering childhood, I think, having spoken to a couple of people with a fourth house Saturn, one of the things is there is this feeling that they never really had a childhood, that childhood was maybe robbed from them, or there was this sort of enforced growing up. So I think for the potentials for having a fourth house Saturn as you grow up is that you can find a house that can be a safe refuge, and that you build structures around you that really work for you rather than having them imposed upon you. Now, if Saturn is about to transit your fourth house, some of these themes I've just spoken about will quite often come to light. Immediately before Saturn goes into the fourth house, it's in the third house, and that marks a time when we might feel disconnected from the community around us, and slightly cut off in our communications with other people, possibly finding learning difficult and finding concentration and language very difficult. It's a time when we need to take purposeful action to feel included. Now, as Saturn moves from the third house into the fourth house, we get a progression of that, where Saturn comes into the home and it gives us an opportunity to restructure our home in a way that really works for us. So I guess if we're looking at Saturn going through a bit of a journey, Saturn changes our outside circumstances, and you can work at building the community, but eventually Saturn comes home and you've got to build the inner community, the inner sanctum, the place where you feel most safe and secure to be a healthy and functioning adult and family. When Saturn comes into the place of your home, it can represent all sorts of structural issues with your house. It can represent a feeling that you're very restricted in the house that you're living in. Maybe it's too small, or maybe you can't afford the payments to be able to afford the kind of house that you've got. It feels like the house that you're in is almost closing in around you and the issues surrounded with it. So it's a time to be really, really clear about where you'd like to live, and if there are pre-existing conditions with where you live while Saturn is in the third house, then it's really important that you get those underway and start looking for what you really want. Because if you're already in the market of looking for a place that's going to work for you, and you've already thought about what will work for you and what won't work for you, then as Saturn goes into the fourth house, it can really help you find the right place and build a strong structure. As ever with Saturn, the key is to be taking meaningful action and moving in the direction, slowly but surely, that you want to move into. So it's really worth ironing out some of the problems associated with Saturn in the fourth house before the transit happens. Now, another way the Saturn energy might affect you in the fourth house might not necessarily be about your home, but it might be about your family. So if you've got ongoing difficulties with a child or a member of the family that lives with you, like possibly an in-law or a parent, then it's time to really start working at what's going on. Because if those problems and situations are allowed to persist as Saturn transits through your fourth house, it's likely to be a time of frustration and difficulty around your relationships with this person, where you feel that you're taking the burden for them and having so much extra responsibility associated with them. So it really is a time when it feels like you've got all the weight of the world on your shoulders. It just feels very, very like a heavy and dense time. So I guess there's family issues, there's house issues, and then also there's the parent issue, because the fourth house is also about the parent. So, for instance, if you're in your 40s or 50s, having Saturn, or even 6, if you're of a certain age where your parents are aging and getting older, then as Saturn goes through your fourth house, it could mark the illness of one of your parents, so that, you know, one of your parents is of concern to you, and you're feeling the burden of needing to care for a parent, or consider them in a new way, in a new light. So it's quite a heavy house to have Saturn going through. What I would say is your willingness to understand what makes you feel limited about your home, your family, and your parents. What makes you feel limited in yourself as a person is the key to managing Saturn, because, as I said right at the start, the fourth house is about your instincts and behaviours, which are formed through childhood. So wherever you are in your instincts and behaviours, if there's an area that feels like you have dis-ease, and an area where you feel restricted and limited and almost like a small child, they're the issues are likely to come up as Saturn moves through the fourth house. You know, and it will be there for a couple of years. You've got time to sort through these issues. And for those of you that are able to cope with the onslaught of the feeling of Saturn in the fourth house, you can really make headway and clear a lot of old ground. It's actually quite beneficial. I've got Saturn moving through the end of my third house at the moment, and it will be moving into my fourth house. So I'm already thinking ahead at some of the possibilities that might be occurring, and seeing as we're considering moving and trying to find a permanent house, that's how I'm hoping to channel the energy. That's how I'm hoping to use the Saturn energy. So right now in our household, and because it's so important and vital to me and my family, I'm really thinking long and hard about the kind of home we find, because if we find the right one, it's very, very possible that we can get a real feeling of being settled very quickly, because where Saturn works and you're working with Saturn, Saturn helps you put down your roots. Anyway, I hope that's been useful. Please do give me a shout if you're going through Saturn in the fourth house, or indeed if you have Saturn in the fourth house and it causes you quite a few problems and you want to talk it through. Feel free, you can reach me at louisa@feelgoodastrology.com or via social media. There's lots and lots of links from my Patreon page to all my other outlets, I guess. Anyway, in the meantime, take care. And watch yourself and enjoy what you can through this transit. Take care.
You've been listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson, and this recording has been made possible by all you lovely supporters at Patreon. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.